go, guys. So I want to make sure you're in the right class. This is World Architecture 1, right? So today we're moving into Egyptian architecture, which I want to remind you guys was a parallel civilization to Mesopotamia. One of the key differences is the character of the civilization. Just as I'm going to continue doing throughout the semester, I want you guys to geographically and cognitively map yourself to where these places are. Remember, I asked you guys to be able to identify the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Persian, or the Arabian Peninsula. There's a lot of stuff that I'm asking you guys to kind of become aware of. Okay, so what I want to show you guys here is, hey, last week we covered Mesopotamia, right? And Mesopotamia was at the top of the Persian Gulf on the east side of the Arabian Peninsula. Well, Egypt is in a different continent, but geographically very close to it. All right, it's to the east of where Mesopotamia, or let's see, that would be, it's hard to tell with these maps, but that would be to the west of where Mesopotamia was located. Okay, so if we take a look on using the globe instead of the Dymaxion map, we have a little bit clearer picture. Although it doesn't show the relationship of all the continents, we can see Africa clearly here. We can see the Arabian Peninsula. We can see the bodies of water that we've been asked to memorize, and we can see the edge of Asia. Okay, so you can see that these two civilizations were relatively close to each other, right? It's not like they existed in different places and times and there may have been no communication between the two. So a little bit closer view of it shows you the general proximity. We're using the Google Earth map here, but there's that same area that we talked about with the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And then down here you can clearly see the Nile River. Right? One of the things that you probably can take from this is how hilly the region is to one side of Mesopotamia and how different the character of Egypt is. There's also a lot of similarities. Okay, so let's continue looking at it. Relationship of Egypt to different sort of civilizations that existed. So here you see, part of Mesopotamia, which included the Assyrian Empire and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. You can see the Persian Empire that, if you recall, took over the Babylonians. And finally you have, on the other side, Egypt. One thing of note is the position of modern-day Israel and the city of Jerusalem, which is a core city to two major religions. All right, looking at a view of like the modern world, we start to see that what was Egypt, right, what is ancient Egypt, is only a piece of what Egypt is today, but it's in the same location. Okay? All right, a little bit closer view. Egypt is often divided into Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, and an area called Nubia. And I need to figure out how to pause this for a moment. Right here. Okay, so as I was mentioning, when we think of Egypt, when we think of ancient Egypt, we're going to think of like three distinct areas. Really, if you wanted to, you could lump it into two, Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay? But we have Upper Egypt at the bottom of the map, and we have Lower Egypt at the top of the map. Doesn't that seem a little strange? Yeah. Seems bizarre, right? But if you think about it, what they're talking about in Upper and Lower is geographic contours. The African continent, as it goes down to the Red Sea and as it goes down to the Mediterranean, is going downhill. It also refers to the direction of the flow of the river. So one of the things that's really important to note is that the Nile starts way inside of Africa. It flows way down and it finally empties at the delta into the Mediterranean. All right. And that's an important distinction, and it's something that sometimes causes people to get confused, especially on a quiz question when you might have a map and it says which one is Lower Egypt and which one is Upper Egypt. Hint, hint, hint. Okay, so let's take a look a little bit at these specific areas. So Lower Egypt, the part up by the Mediterranean, okay? Take a look at the cities of ancient Egypt. You have Alexandria, Rosetta, particularly Giza, Cairo, Memphis, and Saqqara, okay? So make sure you kind of note where those cities were located, all right? And associate them with Lower Egypt. Now let's take a look at Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt, again, using this other map as a reference, you can see that it is up the Nile River, okay, even though it's down on the map. And it's got a whole different set of cities that are associated with it, okay? So make sure you particularly make note of where Karnak, Thebes, and Luxor are, all right? And then finally, there's another area that was conquered by Egypt called Nubia, and there are some ruins or temples that we'll be looking at in a place called Abu Simbel. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the context of how the heck did Egypt start, right? So look at this map. Doesn't that look like a frickin' desert?
Yeah.
It does, right? The bottom part's green and the upper part's dry, right? But before 6,000 BCE, right? Remember, the Ice Age ended sometime or peaked sometime about 14,000 BCE. So the climate of the Earth was very different during the Ice Age, right? The ice caps came way down and areas that were beneath it became temperate zones. So one of the things to note is that in prehistoric times, before about 3,000 or 4,000 BCE, right? Actually, at around the time of 7 to 6,000 BCE, this was a very, very lush area. It was not a desert. And you can see that it's a vast area. It's huge, right? So even if there were a lot of people spread out over all that area, right, as the climate changed and all of the water dried up, those people either died or they migrated. And so those people moved from this central area towards the Nile River, which still had water in it, or up towards Morocco and Spain. Okay? Does that make sense? So now imagine that you take the entire United States and you shove them all into California. It feels like it happened already every afternoon around 4 o'clock. Right? You get on the freeway and it's like, what are all these people doing here? Anyway, but imagine that, right? Imagine that we've got all this disparate, not desperate, population, and all of a sudden it gets squeezed into these two areas. It's going to get a lot denser, right? Okay, so as I was mentioning, around 6,000 BCE, due to a global warming event, that area completely dried up. One of the things that's really important to note is that in that time frame, 6,000 to 4,000 BCE, is just before, right, we get to them starting to actually record history. It's just before we get to the point where there is some level of, yeah, we're kind of keeping track of things. So that period in Egypt is called pre-dynastic, okay, a pre-dynastic period. And it occurred sometime in the range of 6,000 to 4,000 BCE, and we know there were settlements, particularly in Lower Egypt, not Upper Egypt. And this is about where they were located. They became cities later as Egypt developed. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the context and parameters for Egypt. The Nile River, right, is the guiding force. I mentioned to you guys, and this is not in the slide, so you might want to make a note of this. The Nile was very predictable. It flooded in October. It did not flood at random periods. Okay? The Nile comes from the middle of Africa. So it's not coming out of, you know, some mountain somewhere that's got you know, snow-covered peaks, and all of a sudden we get an early summer and it melts and bam, all your crops get swept away. All right? The Nile flooded based on different geographical and climatic conditions. I don't know for sure, I haven't done research, but as I think about it, if it's coming from the heart of Africa, right, I'm guessing that the floods were caused probably more by the monsoonal season and the monsoonal rains occurring in the central part of Africa than by melt-off coming out of a mountain. So that we'll leave as conjecture, because I just made that up. I don't know if it's true or not, but it makes sense. Okay. One of the cool things about Egypt that's important for you guys to know is that unlike Mesopotamia, in that 3,000 year period, there were like 4 major, like, oh, I got to take over you, and then I'm going to take over the other person, and then this person takes over me, and the culture's constantly changing, right? But in Egypt, that didn't happen. It stayed essentially consistent, and it developed consistently under one set of developmental rules over the period of 3,000 years. That's a huge accomplishment, okay? So one of the reasons that it was able to do that, and this is not in the notes, but it is in your reading, okay, is that the early rulers of Egypt, you can look at it however you want. You can look at it as, oh, they figured out how to trick the people, or they believed this. But they set themselves up as being put in place by one of their gods. And so now it wasn't just some guy saying, get your butt out there and harvest my fields. It was God speaking through a man or a woman, right, telling you, you better do this. So in the very early stages of Egyptian civilization, the pharaohs, right, the dynastic pharaohs, established themselves as being linked to these gods. By doing that, they created this like layered society, right? All societies are layered. There's no such thing as an egalitarian place, right? But some places are a little bit more sort of mixed than others, right? If I want to drive to Beverly Hills today, I can do that. If I want to drive to the richest city in the United States, Newport Beach, and go have lunch there, I can do that. Nobody's stopping me. If I want to go to the state capitol building, I can. If I want to go to the capitol building of our country, I can. I can go through the White House. I've been through the White House twice, and I've been through the Capitol building twice. An interesting story about the Capitol building for you guys when I'm not being recorded. Okay, so this idea of this hierarchical society, right, had these deities, gods, right? Ra and Amun and Atek, and there's a whole number of different gods. And then it had the human version of that god, the pharaoh, who was the king, right? And then there were also priests, and there were different levels of priests, okay? And then there were people that were, you know, supporting the priests, and then there was the general population. And there's probably more stratification there than that, okay? So their economy was based on agriculture, and from what we know, it was very closely linked to the flooding of the river, and that's what allowed them to be able to produce so much food. I read somewhere that they produced 3 times as much food as they needed. They were able to do that, which is amazing for a civilization of that of that era. One last thing is that as they conquered people, those people were taken as slaves. Anybody ever heard of a guy named Moses? Right? Moses was part of the Jewish culture, right? Or the Hebrew culture. And the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. They weren't the only ones. There was lots and lots of them. Okay, so one of the interesting things about Egyptian architecture that you guys should make a note of is the fact that we don't have a lot of palaces or civic buildings. We have a fascination and a focus on the dead. The dead or of the other world. Almost all of the architecture that's left to us is in some way tied to these deities or to the death of the pharaohs that were linked to these deities. All the other stuff is gone for the most part. That's different, right? I mean, over in Assyria we had temples and stuff, but we also had palaces. We had gates, city walls. Right. So, as you guys know, I'm recording right now, so I can't really stop to talk to anybody that's at the door. So if you want to wait, I can talk to you then. Okay, so one more thing that I want you guys to kind of understand is that when historians look at Egypt, right, it was divided kind of into three major periods, all of which were tied to dynasties. Okay, so there's the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, right? Bookended by, you know, pre-dynastic and post-dynastic Egypt. Tried to skip over because I had a duplicate slide in there. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about some of the most famous, sort of iconic things in Egypt. Let me ask you guys, what do you guys think is the most iconic thing in Egypt? The pyramids, right? I mean, that's like you think of Egypt and you think of this big pointed thing, right? Okay, so do you think they just invented the pyramids one day? Boom! Oh, I'm gonna create the tallest building in the world, and it's gonna be in the shape of a pyramid. You think they did that?
No.
No, it developed over time, right? So let's take a look at a place called Saqqara, which is a huge necropolis, right, near Memphis, and it dates back to the very beginnings of Egyptian civilization, about 3200 BCE. So one of the things that I don't know if you guys are aware of is the word necropolis. Necros, the dead, polis, city. It's actually a Greek word, not Egyptian. Okay. But a necropolis is essentially a big giant cemetery, a civic cemetery. But to the Egyptians, they thought of it as a city of the dead, because the dead were transformed into, you know, into the gods. They were transformed into the heavens. So the early tombs of this culture that was fascinated with the pharaohs moving on into heaven but having a home on earth, right, was this thing called the mastaba. Okay, and mastaba in Arabic means bench or something like a bench. Okay, it's a giant bench, but a bench nonetheless. The fundamental pattern of the interior arrangement was a subterranean burial chamber surrounded by storage rooms, and then there was the upper part that had a chapel in it. And essentially it was a way of paying homage to this god on earth. Okay, they would actually put food and stuff in there so that this person could live in the afterlife. So there was almost always also some kind of a statue, right? There was an effigy of the king. So I have now had, let's see, 4 interruptions. So I am going to pause this and see what in the heck is going on. Alright guys, this video's gotten too long, so I'm going to stop it and go to the next one.